thanking longtime New England Council member, Fidelity Investments, for graciously sponsoring this morning's program. Many of you know that Fidelity has been a steadfast supporter of the New England Council for decades, and we are incredibly grateful for their ongoing engagement in both our programming and our advocacy work. The company, of course, has a huge presence in the Ocean State, I might add throughout New England, where their Smithfield campus employs well over 3,000 people. Fidelity is represented here this morning by Rick Metters, who serves as the Vice President of Public Affairs and Government Relations here in Rhode Island. Rick will introduce our guests in just a few moments. And speaking of guests, I'd just like to acknowledge the presence of the former congressman here, David Cicilline, who is now the head of the Rhode Island Foundation. I mean, you all know when he was a member of Congress, not only did he do a great job for you and your state and even New England, but believe me when I say this, he was so universally respected on both sides of the aisle because of his intelligence, his way of making friends. There are people like David Congress misses, and we're happy that he is here and he's advocating on behalf of this great state here. So we wish him continued success. Anything he does, he seems to do very well at it. 2026 is off to a great start for the New England Council. I believe, Larry said, that it's our 14th event of the year, and we're about 3 months into the year. We have more programming in store this spring. Later this week, we'll be in Washington, where Congressman Jim Himes will be speaking to the New England Council. Politics and Eggs, which is our signature event in New Hampshire. We bring all would-be presidential candidates to the Politics and Eggs at St. Anselm's in New Hampshire, Goffstown. And a week from today, Rahm Emanuel will be speaking to the New England Council, Politics and Eggs. April, we will be hosting the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Maura Healey, in Boston. Then we leave there. We'll have a breakfast in Hartford with Congressman Joe Courtney, and then back to Washington, D.C. for a breakfast with Congressman Stephen Lynch. And we'll wrap up the month here in Providence with another breakfast with Senator Jack Reed on the 27th. And of course, May is always a big month for the New England Council, as it is when we hold our Washington Leaders Conference in D.C. This year's conference will take place on May 13th and 14th, and we once again look forward to welcoming over 200 New England Council members from all 6 New England states that come down for 2 days of briefing with policymakers, members of Congress, members of the Senate, members of the administration, as well as media personnel who will be convening at a luncheon at the Willard Hotel, which is absolutely spectacular. But anyone that's been there, they leave after 2 days really knowing what is the pulse, who is speaking, who's moving up, who's moving out, what's going in, what's going out. It's just a great. So we do have some time to register, but I do hope that you'll consider coming down and joining 200 other New Englanders. But today we're delighted to welcome back someone who has already established himself as an incredible champion for not only, again, his district here in Rhode Island, but for New England. And again, the reviews from the members of Congress from New England, from Richie Neal and Catherine Clark, is rave reviews on our very special guest here, and that's Congressman Gabe Amo. For purposes of a very formal introduction, I'm pleased to hand it over to Rick Metters of Fidelity Investments.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rick Metters, Vice President of Regional and Public Affairs for Fidelity Investments, and Fidelity is indeed honored to sponsor this morning's New England Council breakfast with Congressman Gabe Amo. Congressman, we admire your lifelong commitment to public service, both at the local, state, and the federal level now, and how you strive to balance the needs of our neighbors with continuing to build a competitive business climate here in Rhode Island. We appreciate your dedication to diverse communities, your commitment to economic growth, and fighting for policies and resources that help make the state a great place to work, raise a family, build a business, in which to retire in securely. Speaking of growth, with over now 6,000 associates based at our Smithfield campus and our Providence Investor Center, Fidelity helps millions of people, including 1 in 4 Rhode Islanders, feel more confident in achieving their most important financial goals, from managing employee benefit programs and supporting wealth management firms and institutions with innovative and technology solutions to grow their businesses. Our expertise and offerings help meet the needs of our unique customers and clients. Our diverse businesses, with over 40 different business units represented in Smithfield, and our independence of 8 decades of service give us insight into the entire market and the stability needed to think and act for the long term as we deliver value to our customers by strengthening and securing their financial well-being. In addition, our commitment to the community is at the core of everything we do, whether it's our Fidelity Cares volunteers providing financial education instruction, donating literally tons of fresh produce from our on-campus organic farm to local food banks, or through now the Fidelity Scholars Program, an initiative that helps provide last dollar scholarships and support services to 150 Rhode Island students over the next 3 years that will allow scholars from underrepresented populations and historically underserved communities to get a degree or professional credential without debt. We seek to improve long-term outcomes in the communities where we live, work, and serve through education, environmental sustainability, diversity, inclusion, and more. We're humbled to be your neighbor and grateful for the opportunity to talk to you this morning and look forward to the conversation between Jim and the Congressman. There's no shortage of issues in which to talk about these days, and would like to welcome the Congressman Gabe and Jim Brett to the stage. Thank you.
I believe the Congressman is going to be speaking to the rising stars that are here, I think around 9:45.
Yeah.
I think I'm one of the falling stars, but that's okay. That's okay.
Never in my heart, Jim.
No problem. I got over it. I just want to thank, again, Fidelity and the Congressman for being here today. Maybe we should just talk what's been in the newspaper for the last several days, and that's Iran. And you're a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Maybe you can tell us what you're hearing, or you can at least provide to the public. Are you clear and confident on why we're there, and also, more importantly, how we exit from there? What does it take?
Well, first, Jim, let me thank you and the New England Council for your decades of leadership, for hosting this great breakfast. I also want to shout out Fidelity. I'm there tomorrow morning. So, Rick, if there are any questions you want to give me in advance, you can slide them my way. But I'm so grateful to have a committed partner right in the 1st Congressional District. And thank you to all of you. I know it was hard getting in this morning. We got used to driving in snow, so we forgot how to drive in the rain. But it's important to see you. Look, as it relates to Iran, I think it encapsulates all of the things that I have criticized alongside my colleagues about this administration. It's chaotic, right? It is full of raising costs for the American people. And when you look at the way that this strategy, or lack thereof, has been executed, it has been full of corruption. We will find out that there are people profiteering off of this sooner rather than later. And that is the theme of this administration, to chaos, the swiftness with which everything moves. A year ago, when we were sitting here, we were reeling from weeks and weeks and weeks of executive orders to dismantling institutions that we care about, to federal funding freezes, foreign aid freezes, all over the place, right? And all the while, if you look at all of the economic forecasters, they're predicting inflation to be at 5%. So that's all wrapped up in what we see. And so I have the opportunity to serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee. My great predecessor, David Cicilline, was actually the subcommittee leader on the Middle East at one point in his career. And so We, have a legacy here in Rhode Island of being very focused on international affairs. It goes back to Claiborne Pell and such. And so it's so important right now that we elevate our voices, but we got to demystify what's happening, right? The challenge we have here is you have a president operating by executive fiat on social media. Last night, or was it this morning? I can't even tell. So I wake up at about 4:45, 5 a.m., and I turn my phone over and I try to see, what did the president say last night? Or what is he saying this morning? And that's every single day, that dread for myself and so many other people. And so he said, well, hold up, thanks to very good talks, I am going to back off on my threat, my 48-hour warning, right, with 36 hours through that 48 hours, to say, well, I'm not going to bomb anymore. Now, the Iranian foreign minister said, we haven't talked to you. We haven't had direct or indirect thoughts. Now, part of this is the president trying to manipulate the market a little bit. He cares about the stock ticker more than any president in history. Why he views it as an assessment of himself, he's talked about it nonstop. When in his wilderness years, he was always talking about the stock market in between terms. And when he came back, he said, well, we've got the best stock market of all time. That's a refrain from him. So as it relates to endgame, I don't think there's anybody, if somebody has the answer in here, you will be a very wealthy person, and that's why we have to ban prediction markets betting home war, but that's a whole different story. But the issue here is, with the Strait of Hormuz, we know that fertilizer comes through there, we know that oil comes through there, unrefined for all sorts of products like diesel and gas. We also know helium. We think about semiconductors, right? Helium play a very important role in the supply chain around semiconductors. So when you constrain the strait, and then you have Iran basically saying, look, we're going to operate as usual here. We're just going to, we're going to threaten anybody who's going to line up against us in this war. But China, you're okay. India, your ships are okay. Russia, your ships are okay. Releasing sanctions at the same time that we're fighting a war against, we're supporting a war in Ukraine, we're fighting a war against Iran, so we're funding the same war for our enemy that we're fighting against them. It makes no sense. So, look, I would hope the president does what many people expect him to do, declare victory at some point, just draw a line. The problem is Iran now has leverage. Leverage is everything. So they now say, well, how do I know this isn't just a temporary pause? I want to extract everything I can, and this is why the nuclear deal, the Iran nuclear deal, was so very important. There were complaints about $400 million. They are getting $16 billion and more through continued operations. The military planners, I think those are, smart people who are doing their best under the constraints of the politicians, the President Trump, the Secretary Hegseth, who we haven't seen out there. Actually, I do want to illuminate this particular point. Who watched Meet the Press yesterday? Show of hands. Okay, wow, nobody's watching Meet the Press anymore. I got to tell Kristen Welker something's up in Rhode Island. But in all seriousness, across the Sunday news shows, the point that I'm making, because a lot of people see this via clips and rather than real time. I don't watch it real time. I see the clips afterward. They sent out the Secretary of the Treasury. What does he know about fighting a war? I mean, he seems like a smart guy who's made billions of dollars, which is a qualification to be in Trump's cabinet. But what does he know about fighting a war? They sent him out there because they have no credible spokespeople for this boneheaded war. It's costing us billions of dollars a day. We would have been able to fund the ACA tax credits like last week. We would have been able to end child poverty across this country, extend the child tax credit, so many more things that we could have done. And I have no opposition to fighting smart wars. No opposition to that. Where was the imminent threat? Tulsi Gabbard, who was supposed to be national intelligence. I mean, that's the opposite of intelligence. When you send somebody out there who says the president gets to decide, the president gets to decide actually informed by you. So I'm concerned, and the fact of the matter, there is no end game. There is no end game. They will keep going until the politics are too bad, or frankly, the loss of life is too bad. Because if you look at the only logical pathways to address some of the president's biggest concerns, and some of my biggest concerns, right, the nuclear material. How do you do that? You can't do that from the air. When you think about all of the various configurations, it's hard to do it without American soldiers. And that's a scary thing. We should never, ever, ever, ever take for granted the lives and the sacrifices of those who love this country and are willing to put their lives on the line for it. Just because they're willing to put their lives on the line doesn't mean that we should push them into venues where they struggle. And at the end of the day, we're all paying for it. Pay for it in our gas prices. We're going to pay for it in the grocery store. We're going to pay for it from the lack of attention to the real needs of the American people. And that's unfortunate. I know that was long-winded, but this encapsulates the whole thing. If you want to understand this administration, look at this.
So the Secretary of War is going to ask Congress for a $200 billion appropriation. So if we're spending like $1 billion a day, does that mean we're going to be there for the foreseeable future if he's asking for $200 billion? And what does that put you and your colleagues, the Democrats, to vote against it? Are you voting against the military? Are you voting against, security? If you vote for it, are you committing yourself voting for the war?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a difficult position to be in.
Yeah.
Your thoughts if this bill ever comes to you and it's $200 billion, what do you think you and your colleagues are going to handle that?
Well, I think we should look at the design of what they put forward. They will not put a standalone bill forward because it won't get the votes. They won't get enough Republicans in the House. Right. Obviously, I'll focus on the House calculus for now. The Senate complicated because they need to get to 60 votes. Now let senators talk about Senate stuff. But when you look at they could not. I've seen from Colorado, Boebert and Thomas Massey and Warren Davidson from Ohio. They've all said some version of I can't vote for that. Like they voted and supported MAGA because there were supposed to be no more foreign wars in the Middle East with great specificity. It wasn't even just no more foreign wars in general in the Middle East. That's what they were sold, the false bill of goods. And so that's why we won't say a straight up bill. I don't think that's possible. Now, they will try to go through reconciliation, right? So everybody knows the congressmen basically do this once a Congress. You can try to get another one in, but it takes a lot of time. And essentially, it goes around the normal process, and the short form of it, it's a way to pass something with a majority vote in the Senate. But it has to be very specific to our fiscal matters. There's something called the bird bath. It sort of basically can't be any sort of it can be ideological, but it can't be any sort of non-germane to the fiscal house. And so essentially, they're going to try a big reconciliation bill, sort of like the big ugly law. They call it the OBBB. I'm not going to call it what they call it. It's ugly. It's gross. Cuts $1.5 trillion from healthcare in America. Nothing like that can ever be called beautiful. But if they do it via reconciliation, it's their only path forward. And so, look, the conditions under which I would support anything is if it goes back to the heart of your original question, which is around support for our troops. The first way to support our troops is not put them in a bad war. That's how you support the troops. Now, if there are funds needed for winding down, for ending this madness, that's something I could support. But that's not what they're pitching. $200 billion is only escalatory. Again, I don't mind the idea that we've trained and prepared the best in the world for good wars, where we are attacked, where there's a threat. And so, they're going to try to make this argument that, Democrats don't support the troops, but they're going to have to be attacking a bunch of Republicans when they do that, too. And so they'll try to do it through reconciliation. I think if it's the only thing they could get through, because they can't even agree what would be in a reconciliation package to begin with. And look, I will do everything I can to support the brave men and women of this country, but I will not give a backdoor approval to this war, which is what they would seek. If you start to pay for something, you're saying that this is legal. This is an illegal war. And if we don't stand up here, the Constitution starts to mean nothing. There's a great article, in fact, President Warner, I think we were talking about it, by Paul Kane. He wrote a column in the Washington Post. I think it was in yesterday's, or maybe 2 days ago. And you just talked about this being a tipping point for the relevance of Congress. If you start to let too many of these things happen, the institution fails. I'm a strong institutionalist. I don't think they're perfect, but I think they provide structure and a path forward. If you break this down after 250 years, right? You know, the irony of this happening all in the 250th year is it's not something that's lost on me. We will irreparably harm the future. This is not just about today, this is about tomorrow.
What about if they put an amendment in on that $200 billion, a good appropriation for Ukraine? Would that sway some Democrats to say, finally, we're giving some relief to Ukraine?
Could. I can think of a few, but I reject the premise that they needed this bill to support Ukraine. All right, there are tons of ways to support Ukraine that isn't going to come in the form of destroying our Constitution and undermining our leadership in the world.
You also serve on the Budget Committee. The defense budget is a little over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
The president in his budget asked for $1.5 trillion, and now we're talking about another $200 billion for defense. You indicated earlier that inflation may go as high as 5%. Are you worried maybe a recession might be coming, that so much money is being spent?
I am worried about a recession, certainly. I mean, the indicators, and obviously we don't know that we're in a recession till we're in a recession, is, you know, the indicator is lagging. But, you know, the issue ultimately will become what sorts of choices on the fiscal side of the house are we make that will influence others. But I think you can anticipate a slowdown. Uncertainty for all of the private sector folks in the room, you know, breeds hesitation. You know that. What is more uncertain or what is a more important uncertainty than the price of oil? Right? We are still driven by fossil fuels in this country. You know, we still, you know, the petro economy is still very significant, which is why we can talk about it, but this is why we have to continue investing in renewables so the shocks are less significant. But all those, you know, truck drivers filling up the tank with diesel right now, all of the households that are thinking about this long winter that we've had, and you know, the home heating oil costs, most prognosticators have said even if the conflict in Iran stopped tomorrow, we would still be feeling the price shocks through the end of the year. Right? That's what you know, the independent analysis suggests. So I don't know how you don't see a slowdown and everybody just sort of hunkering down.
And we just announced recently that our debt is now $39 trillion. And what we pay on the interest of the debt is about equal to what we spend on defense. It just keeps getting higher and higher.
And remember, in the big ugly law for the tax cuts, $4.5 trillion added to that debt. So Donald Trump, in his two presidencies, and I hate talking about Trump all the time, but he's just been so bad for our fiscal house and also a lot of things in the world. But in the two presidencies, you take the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and you combine that with the big ugly, you're talking about tens of trillions of dollars that generations who aren't even born will be paying. That's not okay.
The other big issue in the news and that you're facing day in and day out in Congress is the Department of Homeland Security. We have the TSA, some nationwide, 10% of them have just left their job because they have to find another job in order to pay the bills. It's been like 37 days, going in the second month of no payment for TSA, Coast Guard, Secret Service, Cybersecurity Agency. I know that you and your colleagues put an amendment last week. It was unsuccessful in the sense of let's pay those people, TSA, Coast Guard, Cybersecurity, but it was defeated because
the senators have been voting a lot.
Right.
They've been putting standalone bills to fund individual parts of the Department of Homeland Security, from Coast Guard to FEMA to the Cybersecurity Agency, CISA, Secret Service, Homeland Security investigations, all these other things. Standalone bills fund these things. Because if you actually really mean it, that we should fund TSA, then just pass a standalone bill to fund it. And let's deal with the ICE and CBP, wrongs and terror that they've put on our community separately. It's not that hard. And I actually think the American people don't believe them. They don't believe Republicans on this issue. So the Senate's been voting standalone. We in the House have a discharge petition. So everybody knows a discharge petition is to force a vote on the floor if you have a majority of the House that signs the petition. So there's a new one that we put in last Wednesday. And so I'm supportive of that. I'm a co-sponsor of a bill to fund all of the parts of the DHS except for CBP and ICE. It's going to become increasingly difficult for our colleagues in Congress, the Republicans, to continue to hold their position because you've seen the lines at the airports. They're deploying ICE to airports, which I would think would undermine their arguments entirely. So you can find a way to fund these people, and don't they have enough to do? I thought they were on this big immigration mission, so now they have time to be in the airports. So again, it proves that they are just this roving paramilitary force that can, rotate on the whim of the president's desires. And they didn't have a plan for it. It was very clear that they didn't. Again, on the Sunday shows, Tom Homan said, well, we're working on it. Because the president just tweeted it out. I'm sure it was in some long list of contingencies. Maybe we could do this. And he saw that on the memo, said, brilliant, underlined it, and then tweeted it. That's probably what happened. And so I'm grateful to our TSA agents. I mean, look, I'm in the airport a lot. And I try to stop and talk to them and try to tell them, that I'm rooting for them. Look, if I were them, I would not like anybody like me. It's like you guys in Washington. And they should be upset. The status quo is not okay. The fact that we let this happen to people's families who have to quit and have to go drive Uber or Lyft, I'm not all right with that. But at the same time, you have to stand for something. And so I hope that advancing a plan for funding TSA and the other agencies, because remember, we pre-funded a lot of the Department of Homeland Security in the big, ugly law. So they got $171 billion that's pre-funded for years. On top of that, they have decided to designate those called law enforcement as those who can still get paid. So again, this is all a made-up crisis created by Donald Trump and congressional Republicans. We should be paying these people. And the fact is, it only exists this way because there is no backbone on the other side of the aisle. It is very, very clear if my Republican colleagues stood up and said, I'm going through the airport. I saw a top-ranking member of Congress getting an escort through the airport last Thursday. And I said, that's not okay. Look, I don't want an escort in the airport. I want people to come up to me. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But I want people to come up to me. That's the job. And I said, you high-ranking person, you're walking through this airport escorted by, Capitol Police and going straight to the gate. That's everything that's wrong. And so, look, there should be frustration in America, but at the same time, we've got to ratchet up the pressure. And we need people in communities across this country to call their member of Congress to let them know what's on their mind.
You know, one of the most contentious issues in the House and the Senate is the SAVE Act. And the president has said, I will not sign any bill until you, House, Senate, send me the SAVE Act legislation. Where are we going on that?
Well, again, that's the president telling on himself. The only thing he cares about is holding on to power. The only thing, and he has said this in closed rooms, he said, if you don't pass the SAVE Act, then we're going to lose the House and the Senate, and then they're going to impeach me again. It's all he cares about. It is all about one man. That is exactly what the framers were trying to prevent, right? And so, he said again last night, he was on a rant last night. I think he said something to the effect of, I will not even pass funding for DHS. Thune brought him a deal. The majority leader of the Senate, South Dakota Senator John Thune, went to Trump sometime this weekend, maybe yesterday, and said, I have a deal with the Democrats, a framework on funding DHS. And then a little while after that meeting, the president posted, I will not even sign a deal on DHS until we do the SAVE Act. So here's the crazy thing about the SAVE Act is, for those of you who aren't tracking, right, this requires proof of citizenship for voter registration, in addition to adding a whole bunch of other crazy things, like giving state voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security. They also added a provision on some transgender issue, like non-germane to anything. Just, they're making this a Christmas tree for all of the things that the president likes to talk about, because there is nothing else that he really can accomplish except for riling up the base. That's the only function that he provides. And so the SAVE Act, right? And for those of us who are in Rhode Island, we have voter ID to go to the polls. Like, it's not a thing for us. The big part here is the registration aspect and the proof of citizenship. You've got folks who don't have access to their birth certificate, calling an Office of Vital Records at the local level or calling the state. That's a whole exercise. Passport, they cost money. If you don't have one, something like 40% of Americans don't have a passport. Not everybody is like jet setting, right? So it's not something that everybody has the opportunity to have, especially. And then another aspect to the citizenship component is, for women who have married and changed their names, reconciling those differences, right? You also have segments of the population who sort of, you might be in a nursing home. You might be, homebound for one reason or another. All of these people being disenfranchised. Part of the thing is, if you actually looked at most red states, you'd have a lot of people who would not qualify to verify their citizenship. And so I actually think that this is an idiotic move for them politically, but take that aside, this is just wrong. We banned poll taxes in this country. With an amendment to our Constitution. We have made it very clear that we're not going to make it difficult to vote. The Heritage Foundation has said since 2000, there have been about 200 instances of people voting with the wrong identity, and some non-citizens, some other reason. Nobody wants to break this particular set of laws. I have constituents who aren't sending their kids to school because they're afraid of ICE. You think those people are going to the polls to vote? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So, look, if the president wants to hold the nation hostage because of this, we should be blaring it from the mountaintops. I'm not looking for people's pain to be a political benefit, because ultimately we need a functioning government. And this shows why elections matter, ultimately. Look, if we've lived through Republican presidents, this is not a Republican or Democrat thing. This is, do I want everybody in the country to have a good life or not? And the president, frankly, doesn't care.
There was some good news on an issue that we all know so well, and that's the major housing crisis that we face here, not only in New England, but throughout the country, and with the shortage of affordable housing.
Yeah.
you and your colleagues passed a housing bill in the House,
Bipartisan.
and it was bipartisan, and the Senate has also passed a housing bill. My question is, do you think there will be a conference committee meeting shortly in order to get this bill moving, and your thoughts on whether it's actually going to be on the president's desk?
Yes, so there are two. So everybody knows two competing bills. They're similar, maybe like 80% similar. Some differences, some important differences between the bills in the House and the Senate. But it actually was great. They passed by great big bipartisan margins. I think it was 89 votes in the Senate. I can't remember what the vote count was in the House, but it was significant, very significant. And so there are some differences. There are members who have called for a conference committee to sort of have the House and the Senate get together. We don't do many conference committees. They don't happen that often in the modern era. They used to happen a lot, but they don't really. I think, there was one over in NDAA several years ago. It's just not frequent. On the appropriation side, they have a robust process where they exchange, but it's not quite a conference committee. Look, in this bill, cuts some red tape, allows some access to various loan programs. It's an accelerant. It's a needed accelerant for housing. In Rhode Island, we need to do more, and I'm grateful to the leadership of the General Assembly, with Speaker Shikarchi in particular, who have really led in that regard, and we need to do more at the federal level to complement the great work that has happened in our state. I just don't think, unless there's a signal from the top, being the president, that there will be a conference committee. I mean, he essentially said when this bill first passed that nobody gives about housing. And that is one of the most tone-deaf things that we've heard from this White House, and they don't move without getting a permission slip, really. And so one of the big provisions that is difficult is about private equity, and basically it forces them to sell homes that they've built after 7 years. It's a way to break up. If you own a certain number of houses, you would then have to sell after 7 years. The provision essentially, and this came out of the Senate bill, which is interesting because there wasn't great advocacy from the House here. But this provision essentially is to sort of stop private equity from controlling a lot of housing. The problem is some would argue that would just take them out of the game of wanting to build housing. And so, I'm hopeful that we do something here. I've got a couple bills on housing. One that I've got with Adam Schiff in the Senate it's not part of this package, but I'm going to push really aggressively, especially if we are able to do a big reconciliation package in January 29, is about a tax credit essentially to support the conversion of government buildings, local, state, federal, into housing. Because we, in Rhode Island, we actually have a ton of that, and this would be helpful there.
Vineyard Wind recently reached the milestone of completing construction, but it took an awful lot because there was some stop orders, there was some litigation, just very, very, very costly to say the least. But there are others that are on pause here in the Ocean State and throughout New England. Your thoughts in trying to get you and your colleagues and the regional leaders to try to convince the administration to work with all of you in getting these projects completed?
Well, look, the opposition to wind is a big ideological battle for the president, but they lose every time in the courts, right? With things that have been permitted, projects that are underway, the progress, while they can't unwind, they can delay. And the goal is delay. And I'm hoping that the capital that is out there is patient. It's been really patient. This has been decades of work. But I hope it can outlast the president. And that's the biggest thing that I would say is that he won't be president forever. And the folks in his administration, I don't think they have this broad, generalizable sort of opposition to renewable energy. I just think there are some factions in there that are driven by that. That complemented by hopefully a successful push on permitting reform will ultimately give the assurance to the private sector that we can keep going. But again, it's destabilizing, right? The thing that I said earlier, the lack of predictability, right? You've got to, purchase this energy. You're building infrastructure. The steps therein are so intensive that any sort of hitch can have a chilling effect for the projects that are further out, that haven't, made the progress that we have. Look, we have the first power coming from the project and from Revolution, and so that's really exciting, and we celebrated it, and we'll continue until this thing is done. But I think this is one of the most important fights that we can have, and everything in the Middle East suggests that it is important that we have to move ourselves to the energy of the future, right? I saw a headline yesterday, and this is sort of tangential but related. BYD, the Chinese car maker, now able or has tested out a car that can charge in about 7 minutes, about 70% of the way through. China's, gonna surpass us in this area. Yeah, they still have their fossil fuel dependency, but they're also going to do things that we're unwilling to do because of our politics, and so we just have to keep advancing.
There was a poll out just recently. West Health Gallup poll that said that 33% of Americans have cut back on daily expenses.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
In order to afford healthcare costs. Your thoughts on? There's also a study out that 1 out of 10 people who are on Affordable Care Act are off now. They can't afford the rate increases. Is there anything that you and your colleagues can do to sort of address the healthcare affordability? Yeah,
look, we have to ultimately undo some of the biggest, cuts from that big ugly law. We haven't started to feel that directly of the law, right? Because those Medicaid cuts, which also then trigger, because of its impact on our debt, Medicare cuts. State legislatures and others, that's going to feed itself through the system and our hospital systems over the next several months. That is, frankly, one of the more tragic things that will have happened. Additionally, when you look at the Affordable Care Act, and I see our former Lieutenant Governor and great champion for healthcare in the state, Elizabeth Roberts here, who helped design both our exchange and just the integration with the ACA here in our state. 10,000 people in Rhode Island did not re-up on their marketplace plan, on their plan from HealthSource Rhode Island. I actually think, and the projection was about 15,000. And remember, we're talking about a small pool of people. Put that in proportion to our state's health insurance. So that's just now. These are people who will pay the first couple months, right? It's going to get worse. I actually think by the time you get to the end of the year, you have something like 20,000 people who were eligible and just were priced out. The thing that we did, we had a discharge petition. We actually got some Republicans to get on with us in the House. The Senate gridlocked. Nothing happened in terms of the extension of the ACA credits. Because when they designed the bill, they knew that they would have to keep up with the tax credits. I've talked to folks, people like Jean Lambrou in Maine and others, who designed this. They knew they would have to keep up with the costs over time. And all of the extraction from the Affordable Care Act over the past years, undermining it with court cases and other actions at the federal level, have weakened it. So they're basically 30% of the law kind of remains intact. And so everybody says, the ACA made healthcare more expensive. It's because it never filled its promise. It didn't make it more expensive. In fact, it was weakened and undermined by Congress and President Trump and the courts to a certain extent. So I think what we have to do, my step one, is to deal with these people in the exchanges So I do think there was close to a bipartisan consensus. So if we can get some tax credits for relief there and try to push that at the end of this year, maybe into next year, I think that would be a good first step. But we have to undo most of the ugly law. And that's the biggest thing we can do.
You know, for a small state, Rhode Island's home to a disproportionate number of institutions of higher education. And I think we all agree that the higher education is under attack.
Yeah.
The administration, from limiting financial aid, changing the rules for international students, cutting federal research to these higher ed institutions. Is there anything that you and your colleagues can do to create a little more, at least letting the administration know what the impact is, the economic impact in states like that?
Yeah, we've been very focused on that. I've been very focused on that in particular. One of the things that I went after immediately was the attack on indirect costs. Right, everyone knows the direct costs and indirect costs of research. Right, the indirect costs are things like the overhead, essentially. A lab can't run itself, right? It has a physical space, it has utilities, it has, all of the things, the administrative staff, all of these things that aren't the core of the research. So, I've communicated, with the administration since day one of those cuts in a bipartisan way. There are actually some Republicans who have been vocal there, especially in some of those states where the research institution forms an essential core of the local economy. You think about Birmingham, Alabama, for example. You think about all of these sort of, big research land-grant institutions. So that's been a thing that we've done. I would also say here that in the appropriations process, we've been able to sort of slow some of the most intense types of cuts to research funding on, critical, issues like diseases. I see the Alzheimer's Association here, the brain science, the research, the things that we do that give us a leadership position. So, we have to continue to find ties across the aisle, and that's why I focus on my colleagues who have these big schools that drive their economies. And then we also have to have the institutions sort of come and pitch. Like I sat with the president of Princeton a couple weeks ago and I said, look, you can't fight this fight from New Jersey. You have to come to Washington and demonstrate how you are contributing to, not only the scientific enterprise, but also to making our country stronger. And so, those are some of the things that we can do, but this will always be under attack because a lot of my colleagues believe that you go after higher ed, you go after the liberal institutions, that's how you win the culture war. And we're not fighting a culture war, we're fighting a war so that everybody's family can have opportunity.
The other committee that I believe you serve on, the Science and Technology Committee, is there anything there that you could help? And again, being the ocean state, being the blue economy, with not only what we talked about earlier, the wind, but also shipbuilding and marine research and marine manufacturing. Is there anything in that committee that you have looked at to say, boy, this is something I think we can do for our state of Rhode Island? Yeah,
and it dovetails perfectly with the last question. The research opportunities here are both great for the institutions, but also will yield jobs in our blue economy. I actually just introduced a bill last week called the NOAA-GOMO Act. It's Global Ocean Monitoring and Observation. I know it's very sexy as a topic. But the great unknown, I know we look to the sky, but we should look below the oceans. We still don't know that much about them. We think we do. But you can test a lot of the science and our capacities right here in the Narragansett Bay. In fact, I have Dr. Bob Ballard with me, the famous Dr. Bob Ballard, who's at URI, with me in committee next week. And this bill is bipartisan. In fact, the subcommittee chairperson, the Republican from Florida, is a Naval Academy trained oceanographer. So it's great. And so we are going to do everything we can, to continue to explore our oceans. because across our institutions of higher education here in Rhode Island, we have great possibilities to grow programs and support professionals. I also think that everybody knows that we're going to be the home of the Atlantic Operations Center. My predecessor, Congressman Cicilline, and Senator Reid and Senator Whitehouse played a very big role in NOAA making that decision to be up here. And so they'll be in Newport. That's a big deal for us. So the oceans are huge. Last thing I'll say is just last week, I get confused on the days, 2 weeks ago, I was in Austin, Texas at South by Southwest. And I went with a bunch of startups and RI Hub, our startup high growth incubator. And I wanted to sort of use my presence platform on the science committee and technology committee to have these folks get into an innovation ecosystem. Right, I see our financial institutions here. Capital's got to flow to some of these small guys so that we can have our own booming startup economy. And we've done well, but we usually get one or two every couple of years. We need to go bigger. To all due respect to my Massachusetts friends, they don't have to go up to Massachusetts. We have it all right here. And so, and though we're part of a regional economy, New England Council, but I am doing that. That's sort of not part of my job description, but I think it's important to bring people together, to use this convening power to not just battle the past and battle the chaos of the moment, but march towards a future where everybody has economic opportunity and we're a destination. So I'll keep pushing on that, and blue economy will be a big part of it.
This is election season. What are you hearing from your colleagues in the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and how it looks for you and your colleagues in November?
Well, I'm hoping I do well. So for those of you in the 1st Congressional District, I'm not asking, but anticipate an ask at some point soon for your support. But in all seriousness, I think we have to put ourselves in a position to not just match the historical trend, right? If you look at all the elections that look like this, we're supposed to win and take back the majority. Fine. That's the bare minimum. What we need is a mandate from people around this country who say, we are not going to let the chaos, confusion, corruption, challenge, all of the alliterative C's that you got, we're not going to let them dominate the future. They can't, right? You hear every couple of years, and I know Congressman Cicilline has said this himself, this is the most important election of our lifetimes. This actually is. I've only lived 38 years, so this is definitely the most important election of my lifetime. And it is essential that we send a clear message, but we have to also be for something. We can't just be against, right? The best campaigns are run with a sense of what tomorrow is going to be like. And so I think we'll win back the House, but I don't want to win by default because they're bad. I want to win because we're good. And that's what I'm focused on. And I hope the Senate is similar. Look, this reminds me of 2006. Who thought we were going to win a Senate seat in Montana? We won one in Virginia. Virginia was still pretty red at the time. We had an opportunity in Ohio. That was old Ohio, not new Ohio. But we have some seats that we can win around the country. Alaska is in play. My former colleague is running for the Senate. We even have a really strong candidate in Mississippi. Now, that's going to be a tough one. If it's a really good night, that's where we win. An exceptional night, a historic night. But we still can pick up Senate seats in Alaska, in Ohio. I know, Maine is hotly contested, but there's a lot. And so I think we should leave no stone unturned, leave no door unlocked, leave no American who wants change. And change not for change's sake, but change so their lives can be better. Leave none of them behind.
Well, with that, I want to thank the Congressman for an enlightening and conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And anyone that's interested in the Rising Stars, he's going to be addressing them. Just stay in the room, and they'll be assembling very shortly. But again, I want to thank the Congressman.
Thank you.